Hello everyone, my name is Rohan Gandhi and I'm a third year undergraduate student here at Queen's University. Today I'll be giving you an overview of a very important, current, and ongoing issue relating to Indigenous people in Canada, the Muskrat Falls controversy. Just to give you a brief overview of my presentation, I'll start off by giving you some background info about the issue, what's going on, who's involved, and why the controversy actually arose. Then I want to draw some parallels between the history of colonialism in Canada with regards to Indigenous people and how that actually relates to the Muskrat Falls controversy. Next, I want to go over some of the legal issues we see in this controversy and some possible recourse that Indigenous people may have under the law. Finally, I want to wrap things up with some key insights and recent developments and what's actually happening with the issue right now. Nalcor Energy, a crown corporation of the Newfoundland and Labrador government, is building a multi-billion-dollar hydroelectric dam at Muskrat Falls, and this is situated on the lower Churchill River in Labrador, about 30 kilometers west of Happy Valley Goose Bay. This is nearby to Lake Melville, where many Indigenous communities live. A significant step required to finish the project is the flooding of a 41 square kilometer reservoir for the dam. Soil and plants naturally contain mercury, and the flooding and the subsequent rot can cause them to release the carbon that fuels a process called methylation, resulting in the formation of a neurotoxin called methylmercury. Now, not only does methylmercury have the potential to poison the fish that many of these Indigenous people rely on as a food source, but methylmercury also has been linked to heart issues and intellectual deficits in children. Because of that threat, the Inuit protesters are demanding that Nalcor Energy completely clear out the trees, plants, and soil from the reservoir before they flood it. Nalcor initially agreed to remove the trees, but not the soil. The Nunavut government later launched a study with Harvard University scientists, which concluded that methylmercury levels could rise as much as 380% in Lake Melville if the reservoir was only partially cleared before flooding. The researchers said that the increase could be drastically reduced to 13% if the reservoir was fully cleared. The controversy was escalated in 2016 because although the project had been in works for years, the flooding of the reservoir was actually scheduled to begin that fall. Now, it's important to note here that Inuit protesters and the Nunavut's Natural Resources Minister have publicly declared that they don't actually oppose the project itself, but want to see it done right, specifically with regards to clearing the reservoir area to minimize the risk of methylmercury contamination. The Muskrat Falls controversy is a classic example of colonialism still present in Canada today. Ironically, colonialism in Canada first began on the East Coast, where European settlements displaced Indigenous people in Canada's near north, including communities in Happy Valley Goose Bay and Churchill River. Three elements of colonialism that are really prominent with the Muskrat Falls crisis is the loss of sovereignty, loss of tradition, traditional practices and way of life, and negative health and environmental impacts resulting from governmental projects. And I'll go into more depth with each one of these in the next slides. But before I do, it's important to note that the government seems to use a classic defense when it comes to issues like this, and that's the defense of terra nullius, historically used by European settlers to argue that the land belonged to nobody and was free to be taken by anyone and used by anyone who wished to exploit it, which was the case here in the Muskrat Falls controversy. The first element of colonialism I want to discuss is the loss of sovereignty for Indigenous people, specifically relating to the lack of authority and decision-making power they have with regards to what is happening on their land or surrounding their land. The issue of land and the right to have authority and decision-making power on it is crucial to the survival of the Indigenous community near Muskrat Falls. We see spiritual resources continue to be destroyed by developmental projects that seize and contaminate land and water. And despite the massive public outcry and protests over this project, especially over something as simple as removing soil from a reservoir, the concerns of Indigenous people were brushed off almost entirely. It took for 3 people to go on a hunger strike to get the government to do something. After an 11-hour meeting with Inuit officials, the government came to a compromise. However, a year later, prominent Inuk leaders spoke out saying that the government didn't actually hold up its end of the bargain. It's important to keep in mind that hunting and fishing are not just an important source of food for the Inuit community in Labrador, but it's also a traditional way of life. And so by reducing and effectively poisoning the fish there, you're taking away a core part of their culture and traditional practices. This is a typical example of colonialism and has been a historical practice for the Canadian government. Billy Gauthier, a renowned Inuk artist, publicly came out and said that the land that the Inuit government and the government is involved with is directly related to his inspiration and is an inspiration for some of the art he does. Taking away some of that land is a direct violation of the traditional ways of life of Inuit people and is directly taking away a big portion of his culture. Another classic element of colonialism we see is the negative health effects and environmental effects arising from governmental projects. We see this in so many other issues apart from the Musket Falls crisis, such as the Jumbo Valley issue in British Columbia and the Chaudière Falls issue in Ottawa-Gatineau. And Musket Falls is just another example of this happening. In this case, Nalcor essentially ignored the Harvard study and commissioned its own study, which conveniently concluded that the river would be diluted before it actually reached the Inuit community. This is a classic example of cost reduction versus sustainability decision, and it seems that there's an ongoing trend of the government choosing profit and cost reduction over sustainability. Now moving on to some of the legal issues. I've identified 4 main legal issues relating to the Musket Falls controversy. The first one is treaty disputes. Is what the government did a direct violation of any treaties signed between the government and the Indigenous community? The second one is land claim disagreements. And this one is not just with relating to the Inuit community in Lake Melville, but also with surrounding communities. Number 3, protests, which have often caused project delays, pushed timelines, and have increased costs. And finally, hunger strikes that have put an immense pressure on the government to take action. Let's jump into each one of these slides in more detail. First issue is treaty disputes. And one of the treaties that gets called into question here is the British Inuit Treaty of 1765, which promised protection from the British Crown and outlined treaty rights, especially with regards to harvesting natural resources. What the Canadian government did with regards to, poisoning fish relating to this issue is a direct violation of this British Inuit Treaty of 1765. Another treaty that comes into question here is the Labrador Inuit Lands Claim Agreement that was signed in 2005, which provides Inuit self-government within the Nunatsiavut settlement area, which is directly the area in conflict here with the Musket Falls crisis. Chapter 13 of this agreement, which is titled Sustainable Utilization, directly relates to the issue of fishing and aquatic plants as well as fish habitats, stating that the management of these features must be done so in a way that does not impair their natural viability in order to meet the needs of the present, and may be met without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. It can be argued here that the Canadian government is directly violating this agreement with not taking into regards any claim of the Inuit people's right to fish in a safe, productive manner. The second issue here is unsettled land claim agreements. Another Inuit community called the Nunatu-Kavut tried to also negotiate with Nalcor, saying that their land is also being directly affected. But Nalcor completely refused to negotiate with them, stating that their land claim has not even been organized with the government. Now this here is an issue that has a possible recourse under the law, which we've already considered in our course lectures. The Haida Nation versus British Columbia case, where the Supreme Court concluded the Crown has a duty to consult with Aboriginal peoples where it has a knowledge of an existing claim and is contemplating actions that might adversely affect it. Dozens of protests in the Musket Falls crisis has resulted in dozens of project timeline increases as well as cost increases. And this has become an issue for both Nalcor as well as the Indigenous community, especially when protesters started to block the entry into the Musket Falls main gate, preventing workers from leaving their site. The question of whether the project should completely cease until all negotiations are settled, or whether the project should continue in the meantime, has been an issue, specifically with regards to the workers and the legal issues surrounding there, and what should be done about it. Finally, some hunger strikes especially some from the renowned Inuk artist Billy Gauthier, has really put pressure on the Canadian government to take action. When Billy Gauthier went on a hunger strike, two other prominent individuals went on strike with him, putting immense pressure on the Canadian government to take action. It led to an 11-hour meeting between the Inuit officials and Premier Ball, where Premier Ball promised to further investigate contamination effects. As we can see here, hunger strikes have directly led to the government to taking action. And it's interesting to see what the Inuit community has to do in order to effect change. In conclusion, it's important to take into account some of the recent developments in this story. Billy Gauthier recently spoke out stating that the government didn't actually live up to its side of the agreement in exchange for ending the hunger strike. And a recent scientific study looked into Nalcor's independent study some more and determined that the assumptions that Nalcor made with regards to that study were actually incorrect. And the study can't actually be taken seriously. Finally, a lot of tensions arose when several Inuit activists were jailed, and a lot of violence broke out, leading to even more arrests. Ultimately, it's evident that the tensions are rising as violence and arrests are increasing. And so while the conflict with the Inuit community slowed down the project and certainly resulted in minor changes, it's evident that the project is still moving forward, mostly as planned.